silent watcher in the woods. I needed a break. It was late October last year, and life had been relentless. Work deadlines, a messy breakup, and that general sense of burnout that creeps up on you when you haven't caught your breath in months. So I did what any sensible person would. I booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was advertised as secluded, serene, and perfect for disconnecting. Just what I needed. I found it on some rental site, tucked deep into the woods of northern Michigan, far from cell service and civilization. The pictures were charming. Wood-paneled walls, a cozy fireplace, and a porch overlooking a lake that looked like it belonged on a postcard. When I arrived, the drive alone felt like peeling away layers of stress. The road narrowed until it was more dirt than pavement, canopied by golden autumn leaves. The cabin itself was exactly as pictured, except for one odd thing: the curtains. They were drawn across every window, even in broad daylight. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the previous guests left them closed, or the cleaning crew didn't bother. I unloaded my stuff, poured a glass of wine, and settled in to watch the sunset from the porch. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the wind rustling the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird. But as the light faded, something about the quiet started to feel wrong. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. As the night fell, I decided to check out the cabin more thoroughly. I'm not usually nosy, but something about those drawn curtains kept gnawing at me. When I peeked behind the one in the living room, I felt my stomach drop. Outside, nailed to a tree just within view of the window, was an old, rusted camera. It looked like something from decades ago, a bulky box with a long, cracked lens. For a second, I convinced myself it was just some quirky decoration someone had forgotten to take down. But then I saw the faint red glow of a recording light. My heart started pounding, and my first thought was to laugh it off. Maybe it was just leftover from some amateur wildlife filming project. But why was it pointed at the cabin? I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe this was just some eccentric local's idea of security. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, so I drew all the curtains tight again and locked the door. It was silly to feel this paranoid in such a gorgeous place, but I couldn't stop pacing. That's when I realized my phone wasn't charging. I went to check the outlet, but it wasn't the charger, it was the power. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I was standing there in pitch blackness, the kind where your eyes take forever to adjust, and you can't even see your hand in front of your face. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves outside. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to hear them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer, or a raccoon scavenging through the brush. But these steps were too deliberate, too heavy. My mind raced. Should I call for help? My phone was dead. Should I turn on a light? The power was out. I crept toward the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find, my hands trembling as I gripped the cold steel handle. For a moment, I felt ridiculous. Who rents a cabin to relax and ends up clutching a knife in the dark? Then I heard the doorknob jiggle. Just a slight, testing rattle, like someone was checking to see if it was locked. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I backed into the corner of the living room, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The doorknob stopped moving, and the footsteps shifted again, this time heading toward the back of the cabin. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen in place. It was then that I realized something even worse. I wasn't just being watched. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. I kept listening, straining my ears to catch every sound. The footsteps had stopped, but that didn't comfort me. If anything, it was worse not knowing where they were. Slowly, I forced myself to creep toward the window. Just a quick peek, I thought, enough to see if someone was still out there. I moved the curtain barely an inch, holding my breath, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, just standing there, motionless, about 20 feet from the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a tall figure, shrouded in darkness. They weren't moving, weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching. My mind raced. Who could it be? A lost hiker? A local messing with me? But something about the stillness was wrong. Most people would at least wave, call out, or approach the cabin if they needed help. This person just stared. I wanted to scream, to yell at them to leave, but fear kept me silent. My only option was to wait them out, hope they got bored and left. But then, they did something I wasn't prepared for. They raised their hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the cabin. Toward me. It wasn't random. It was like they knew exactly where I was standing. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. How could they have seen me? The curtains were barely open. I dropped to the floor, clutching the knife like it was the only thing tethering me to sanity. My mind was a storm of thoughts. Should I make a run for it? No, the car was parked a good 50 yards away, and I'd have to cross the clearing to reach it. Besides, I didn't even know if they'd slashed my tires or sabotaged the engine. The rational part of me wanted to believe this was some kind of sick prank, but another part, the one that was sweating and shaking, knew better. This wasn't random. Whoever this was, they'd planned for me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The silence outside was unbearable, like the world itself had gone mute. I stayed crouched on the floor, staring at the locked door, waiting for something. Then I heard it, a metallic click. It took me a second to realize it was coming from the back door, the one that led out to the porch. The cabin didn't just have a single entry, it had two. My stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't checked to see if the back door was locked. Another click, this time louder. Someone was trying to pick the lock. I couldn't wait any longer. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted toward the back door, gripping the knife tightly. My bare feet slapped against the cold wooden floor as I reached the door just in time to hear the faint scrape of metal against the lock. Without thinking, I shoved the heaviest chair I could find under the doorknob. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the knife. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting to see what the intruder would do next. The clicking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, 3 sharp knocks, deliberate and loud, echoed from the other side. "Who's there?" I finally shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. Just another knock, this time slower, like they were mocking me. I backed away from the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But where could I go? My only option was the car, and if they were this close to the cabin, they'd catch me before I even made it halfway. That's when I heard the sound of glass shattering. My blood ran cold. They'd broken a window. The sound of breaking glass jolted me into action. I ran toward the bedroom, the only room with a lock on the door, and slammed it shut behind me. My breathing was ragged, and my chest felt like it might explode. I wedged a dresser against the door, every muscle in my body burning with panic. The window in the bedroom faced the driveway, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could make a run for it if they tried to come through the front. But as I peeked outside, my stomach sank. The car was useless. Both tires on the driver's side had been slashed, the rubber sagging like deflated balloons. I collapsed onto the floor, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was out there. Then I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards. They were inside. Each step echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate. I could hear them moving through the living room, pausing as if they were searching for something, or someone. The sound grew closer, and I knew they were heading toward the bedroom. My mind raced. Should I fight? Hide? My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use. That's when I noticed it, a tiny blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling. The red light wasn't there when I first arrived. I was sure of it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but now that I'd noticed it, I couldn't look away. A camera. Someone had been watching me the whole time. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just a random break-in. It was planned, orchestrated down to the last detail. I tried to ignore the panic rising in my chest, focusing instead on the sounds outside the door. The footsteps stopped just beyond the bedroom. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't try the door. Then, to my horror, I heard the distinct scrape of the dresser being dragged away from the door. I didn't think, I just acted. I climbed onto the bed and yanked the camera down from the ceiling, hoping to find some clue, anything that could help. But as soon as I ripped it out, the lights in the cabin flickered back on, illuminating the room in an eerie yellow glow. For a second, I felt a sliver of relief. But then I heard it, a voice distorted and hollow, coming from somewhere in the house. "We're watching you." It wasn't a shout, just a calm, chilling statement, as if whoever said it wasn't in a hurry. The voice sent ice through my veins, and before I could think twice, I shoved open the bedroom window, ready to leap into the cold, dark woods. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I tumbled out of the window, landing hard on the damp ground below. I didn't have time to feel the pain shooting through my knees and palms. My only thought was to run. The woods were pitch black, and the thick canopy blocked out even the faintest sliver of moonlight. I stumbled forward, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear movement, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves, not running, but following. They knew I had nowhere to go. I pushed myself deeper into the forest, but the farther I went, the more I realized how lost I was. Every direction looked the same, trees looming like dark sentinels, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. My legs felt like lead, and every sound around me felt amplified. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, even my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a searchlight, or maybe even another cabin. Desperation pushed me toward it, my mind clinging to the hope that someone else might be nearby. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't coming from a building. It was coming from a fire. The fire was small, barely more than embers glowing in the center of a crude circle of stones. Around it were scattered objects, torn pieces of fabric, a rusted metal canteen, and what looked like a pair of shoes, one of them missing its sole. My stomach twisted as I took in the scene. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, or maybe they hadn't left at all. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the fire wasn't old. The embers were still alive, the warmth radiating against the chill of the night. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still close by. Before I could decide what to do, I heard it again, the voice. This time it was clearer, closer, and not distorted like before. "You shouldn't have come here." My head whipped around, and that's when I saw the figure standing just beyond the firelight. They were taller than I expected, wearing a hooded jacket that obscured most of their face. I couldn't tell if they were holding anything, but their presence was enough to send me staggering backward. "Who are you?" I shouted, though my voice cracked, betraying my terror. They didn't answer. They just stepped closer, their shadows stretching long across the ground. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure stopped just short of the fire, their face still hidden in shadow. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice shaking so badly it barely sounded like my own. They tilted their heads slightly, as if considering my question, then said, "You came to the wrong place." Their tone was calm, almost casual, but it sent a chill down my spine. Then they took another step forward, and in the flickering firelight, I caught a glimpse of their hand, gloved, but stained with something dark and wet. I didn't need to see more. My body finally responded, and I bolted. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the forest, blind to where I was going. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between me and that figure. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard the steady crunch of leaves, unhurried but relentless. They weren't running, they didn't need to. They knew the forest better than I did. Every time I thought I might be losing them, the sound of their footsteps would pick up again, closer, like they were toying with me. Then, through the trees, I spotted something. A structure, small and weathered, almost invisible in the dark. The structure was an old shed, barely standing, with warped wooden planks and a rusted tin roof. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but it was my only option. I threw myself against the door, which gave way with a groan, and slammed it shut behind me. The inside smelled of mildew and rotting wood, and my feet crunched on something brittle, old leaves or maybe animal bones. My hands scrambled to find something to barricade the door, but the room was nearly empty except for a broken chair and a stack of rotted crates. I jammed the chair under the handle and pressed my back against the door, struggling to catch my breath. For a moment, there was silence. No footsteps, no voice, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. I thought maybe I'd lost them. Maybe they'd given up. But then I saw it, through a gap in the planks, a faint glow of light. A flashlight. It swayed back and forth as it moved through the trees, drawing closer with every second. My chest tightened as the beam finally stopped, pointed directly at the shed. I could hear them now, their footsteps slow and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. And then, a soft tap at the door. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like they were daring me to react. I clutched the knife tighter, every muscle in my body taut with fear. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of panic. For a moment, the tapping stopped, and I held my breath, hoping they might actually go away. But then, a low chuckle came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "You're not getting out of here," the voice said, calm and deliberate. My stomach twisted. They didn't sound rushed or angry, just confident. I pressed myself against the door, trying to think, trying to come up with a plan. That's when the first blow came. It wasn't a knock this time. It was the sound of something heavy slamming into the door, shaking the entire shed. Dust rained down from the rafters as I stumbled backward. The chair I'd wedged under the handle shifted, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. My eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. Then I saw it, a small window near the ceiling. It was barely big enough to crawl through, but it was my only chance. Without hesitating, I scrambled onto the stack of rotted crates beneath the window. The wood creaked and shifted under my weight, but I didn't care. My hands fumbled to unlatch the window, my fingers slipping on the damp, warped frame. Another slam rocked the shed, and I heard the chair skitter across the floor. They were going to break through any second. With a grunt, I shoved the window open and hoisted myself up, squeezing through the narrow opening. The jagged edges of the wood scraped my arms and legs, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. I tumbled out onto the ground outside, gasping for air as the cold night enveloped me. I didn't have time to rest. The door to the shed burst open behind me with a deafening crack, and I caught a glimpse of them in the doorway. The flashlight beam swept across the clearing, just missing me as I bolted into the woods. My feet pounded against the earth, my lungs screaming for air. The woods seemed endless, every tree looking the same, but I kept running, refusing to look back. Then, through the darkness, I saw something that made my heart leap. A road. A narrow, gravel road cutting through the trees. If I could just make it there, maybe someone would pass by. Maybe I could finally escape. I burst onto the gravel road, my legs trembling so badly I nearly collapsed. For a split second, I felt relief. Something about the open space felt safer than the suffocating woods. But the relief was short-lived. The crunching footsteps followed, relentless, still just far enough behind me that I couldn't see them but close enough to hear. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and desolate. There were no headlights, no sign of life, just the oppressive darkness pressing down on me. I turned right and started running, praying I'd find something, anything that could help. Then, in the distance, I saw it. Faint headlights bouncing through the trees. A car. I screamed, waving my arms as I stumbled toward it, my voice hoarse and raw. Help! Please, stop. The car slowed as it approached, its brakes squealing slightly on the loose gravel. It was an old pickup truck, its paint chipped and rusted. The driver, a grizzled man in a baseball cap, rolled down the window, his face etched with concern. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps emerged from the woods behind me. I turned to look, but the road was empty. The figure had vanished. "Someone's after me," I stammered, barely able to get the words out through my gasping breaths. "They're in the woods. They tried to get into the cabin." The man's expression darkened as he leaned out of the window, scanning the tree line with a wary look. "Get in," he said, jerking his thumb toward the passenger side. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw myself into the truck, slamming the door just as he hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment on the loose gravel before gripping, and we sped down the road, leaving the woods behind. For the first time all night, I felt a sliver of safety. The man drove in tense silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Where were you staying?" he finally asked, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. I told him about the cabin, about the cameras, the power going out, the figure outside. His face hardened with every detail. When I finished, he shook his head. "You're lucky," he muttered. "Couple years back, people went missing near those woods. Cops never found much. Just signs." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't want to know. The rest of the drive passed in silence, except for the occasional crackle of static from the truck's old radio. Every shadow on the road felt like it might move. Every rustle in the trees outside made me flinch. The man eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small-town diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dark. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice firm but kind. "There's a payphone inside. Call the cops. Call someone you trust." I nodded, muttering a shaky thank you as I stepped out of the truck. He waited until I was inside before pulling away, his headlights disappearing into the night. Inside the diner, everything felt surreal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. A waitress with tired eyes handed me a menu, but I didn't even glance at it. I used the payphone to call the police, explaining everything as coherently as I could. They promised to send someone, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to find. No sign of the figure, no footprints, no evidence in the cabin except the broken window and slashed tires. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. But one thing I do know, I'll never go back to those woods again. The passenger. I'll admit, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's not because I'm scared, really, but you just never know who you're letting into your car. But that night, it was raining so hard I could barely see the road. And there he was, standing on the shoulder with his thumb out, soaked to the bone. He looked harmless enough, a skinny guy in his mid-30s, maybe a little rough around the edges, but nothing that screamed danger. Something about the weather, or maybe my own tiredness, made me stop. I figured it was just a short ride, and he looked like he needed it. He got in, thanked me in this low, gravelly voice, and we started off. At first, it was fine. We talked about the storm, how he'd been walking for miles, stuff like that. But then his tone changed. It wasn't sudden, exactly. It was more like the shift happened so gradually that I didn't notice at first. He started telling me about the places he'd been and the people he'd met, and the stories were off. He described fights in bars, arguments that ended with people getting taught a lesson, and more than once, he said something like, "I'm not proud of what I've done, but some folks just need it, you know?" I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or not, but his face was dead serious. His eyes stayed locked on the road ahead, and I realized he wasn't blinking much. The car felt smaller, the air thicker. That's when he mentioned the last person who picked him up. "Nice guy," he said, but he didn't listen when I told him to keep driving. I felt a chill crawl up my spine when he said that. I didn't want to ask, but the silence was unbearable, so I muttered something like, "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes catching mine for just a second too long, and said, "Let's just say he learned the hard way." Then he chuckled, this low, humorless sound that made my stomach flip. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to act like it didn't bother me. My mind raced, analyzing every word he said, every movement he made. Was he joking, trying to mess with me, or was this guy actually dangerous? I wanted to tell him to get out, but I was in the middle of nowhere, with miles of dark, empty road ahead. He kept talking, but now it wasn't even a conversation. It was like he was confessing. He started describing things in detail, awful things, about how people deserved what happened to them, how some folks push you too far. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my heart was pounding. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, and said, "You ever wonder what it'd feel like to just snap? To finally do something about it?" My throat felt dry, and I could barely squeak out a response. No. Can't say I have." He smirked, like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, and said, "Guess you're a better person than me, then." I kept driving, counting down the minutes until I could drop him off somewhere, anywhere, but he didn't seem in a hurry to get out. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, and started asking me questions. Not normal ones, though. He wanted to know if I lived alone, if I had family nearby, if anyone knew I was on the road that night. I tried to play it cool, giving vague answers, but my gut told me he was fishing for something, sizing me up. Every answer I gave seemed to amuse him, like he knew something I didn't. At one point he said, "You know, I bet you're the kind of person people underestimate. Quiet, polite, but I bet there's a side to you no one sees." I laughed it off, but inside, I felt like screaming. The rain was coming down even harder, and I spotted a gas station up ahead, one of those small, run-down places that barely look open. I saw it as my out. "I need to stop and fill up," I said, trying to sound casual. He just nodded, staring out the window. As I pulled into the station, I glanced at the attendant inside, a young guy who looked half asleep behind the counter. I parked near the pumps and cut the engine. "Be right back," I said, hoping he wouldn't follow me. To my relief, he stayed in the car, staring at something in the glove compartment. I got out, trying to steady my shaking hands as I walked toward the station. Inside the gas station, I pretended to browse the snacks while stealing glances at my car. He was still in there, sitting unnervingly still. I thought about telling the attendant, but what could I say? "Hey, there's a guy in my car who might be a murderer." The guy behind the counter didn't seem like he'd be much help anyway. He barely looked up from his phone. My phone. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, but of course, I had no signal. Typical. The storm had knocked out service, and I was on my own. I considered just leaving, running out the back and hoping he'd give up and take the car. But my keys were still in the ignition, and I wasn't ready to explain why I abandoned my car to the police later. I walked back outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking through my jacket almost immediately. As I got closer, I realized the passenger door was open, and he was gone. My stomach dropped. I glanced around the lot, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim light of the station. Then I saw him, standing near the edge of the woods that lined the station, just barely visible under the flickering light of a street lamp. He was facing me, but he wasn't moving, just watching. I stopped in my tracks, unsure what to do. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car and leave, but something about the way he stood there rooted me to the spot. It was like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I forced myself to move, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the car. I kept my eyes on him the whole time, half expecting him to charge at me or say something, but he didn't. He just stood there, completely still, his head slightly tilted like he was studying me. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to open the driver's door. I slid in, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but before I could throw it into gear, he started walking toward me. Not running, walking. His movements were calm, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he wasn't heading for the passenger side. He was coming around to the driver's window. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires skidding on the wet pavement as I backed away. He stopped, standing right in the middle of the lot, his hands in his pockets. For a split second, I thought I saw him smile, but it might have been the way the light hit his face. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the station, the rain blurring my vision. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me, but the road was empty. Still, I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I parked in a well-lit lot, locked the doors, and just sat there, trying to calm down. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the rain as it streaked down the windshield. My hands were still trembling, and my breathing was shallow, like I'd just run a marathon. Every creak of the car, every flash of lightning made me jump. I kept telling myself I was safe now, that he was miles behind me, but it didn't help. All I could think about was his face, the way he'd stared at me like he knew something I didn't. The way he didn't run after me, didn't shout or try to stop me. He just stood there, calm as could be, like he knew this wasn't over. Eventually, I worked up the courage to drive again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, paranoid that I'd see headlights in the distance, but the road stayed empty. Still, the unease didn't leave me. Even when I reached the motel I'd booked for the night, I couldn't relax. I double-checked the locks on the door and wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, just watching. I ended up sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the night passed quietly, too quietly. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and the sun was just starting to rise when I finally decided to leave the motel. I hadn't slept at all, but I couldn't stand being in that room any longer. I loaded up the car and got back on the road, eager to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. The fear from the night before had dulled a little in the daylight, but it hadn't disappeared. Every car that passed me felt suspicious. Every hitchhiker on the side of the road made my stomach churn. I kept telling myself it was over, that I'd gotten away, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. About an hour into my drive, I stopped at a diner for coffee. I was still jittery, but the normalcy of the place, people eating pancakes, the clatter of dishes, helped me feel a little more grounded. When the waitress brought my coffee, I glanced out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. Parked across the street, half hidden by a line of trucks, was a car that looked just like mine. The same make, same color, even the same dent in the bumper. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it wasn't possible. It had to be a coincidence, right? But then I saw it. The passenger door was slightly ajar, like someone had just stepped out. And standing next to it, watching me through the diner window, was him. I didn't stay to find out what he wanted. I threw some cash on the table and bolted out the back exit, sprinting to my car. My heart was in my throat as I sped away, weaving through side streets, taking random turns, anything to lose him. Eventually, I found myself back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere. Waiting. Watching. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I've never picked up a hitchhiker again, and I never will. Shadows in the corn. It was the summer of 2019, and my girlfriend Jenna and I were driving cross-country from Chicago to Denver. We'd been planning this road trip for months, hoping to take in the big skies and endless fields of the Midwest before reaching the Rockies. At the time, we were both in our late 20s, just out of grad school and desperate for adventure. The kind where you didn't have a strict itinerary, just a map, a playlist, and the thrill of the unknown. That day, we decided to take the scenic route. No highways, just country roads. It was peaceful at first, the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're in an old postcard. But by late afternoon, the charm wore off as the GPS started cutting out and we realized we were lost. I remember the heat that day, how the sun pressed down on the car, turning it into an oven despite the AOC blasting. We hadn't seen another car or house for miles, just endless rows of cornfields and the occasional weather-beaten barn. It felt like we were driving in circles. Finally, just as we were debating whether to turn back, we spotted a farmhouse up ahead. It was the first sign of life we'd seen in over an hour. A tall, white-clapboard house with a sagging porch and a big oak tree out front. I pulled the car up the gravel driveway, relieved. But as we got closer, something about the place felt off. The house looked lived in but neglected, like it had been patched together 100 times over the years. A rusted swing set stood crooked in the yard, and a weathered no trespassing sign was nailed to a fence post, almost hidden in the weeds. Jenna was hesitant about going up to the house. "I don't know," she said, her voice tight. "Something about this place doesn't feel right." I brushed it off, telling her it was probably just an old family farm. Nothing unusual out here in the middle of nowhere. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Still, we needed directions, and turning around without asking felt like admitting defeat. So I parked the car, and we walked up the uneven path to the front porch. The boards creaked loudly under our feet, the sound cutting through the stillness of the late afternoon. I knocked on the screen door, which rattled on its hinges. For a long moment, there was nothing but the distant rustle of wind through the cornfields. Then, the door opened just a crack. A man stood there, maybe in his late 40s, with a wiry frame and a sunburned face. His hair was thinning and greasy, sticking to his forehead in clumps. He looked at us without saying a word, his pale blue eyes darting between Jenna and me like he was trying to size us up. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Can I help you?" he asked, though there was no friendliness in the question. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my neck. "Hi, sorry to bother you," I said, keeping my voice upbeat. "We're a little lost. Our GPS isn't working, and we're trying to get back to Route 50. Could you point us in the right direction?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, one hand gripping the edge of the door, the other out of sight. I noticed a faint smell coming from inside the house, something sour, like spoiled milk or wet wood. Jenna shifted uncomfortably beside me, her fingers brushing against mine in a silent plea to leave. Finally, the man muttered, "Wait here." He stepped back, shutting the door hard enough to rattle the frame. We stood there in the awkward silence, the air around us feeling thicker by the second. Through the screen, I could see the dim interior of the house, shadows moving in the gloom, though I couldn't tell if it was people or just the way the light played tricks. I whispered to Jenna, maybe this was a bad idea. She didn't say anything, just nodded, her eyes locked on the door like she expected it to fly open any second. When the man came back, he wasn't alone. A woman had joined him, her face almost ghostly pale under a mop of tangled gray hair. She held a baby on her hip, though the child was eerily quiet, not even a coo or a squirm. The woman didn't smile, didn't acknowledge us at all. She just stood there, her eyes darting nervously between us and the man, who now had a piece of yellowed paper in his hand. "Take this," he said, shoving the paper toward me. I glanced at it, a crude map scribbled in pencil, with no landmarks or street names, just arrows pointing in vague directions. I took the map, my hand brushing against his rough, calloused fingers. "Thanks," I said, though my voice came out shakier than I intended. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me like he was waiting for something. The woman shifted the baby on her hip, and for the first time, I noticed the child's face. Its skin was waxy and pale, eyes half closed like it was barely awake, or not awake at all. Jenna must have seen it too, because she tugged on my arm, whispering under her breath, "Let's go." "Now." I nodded and turned to leave, but as we stepped off the porch, the man spoke again, his voice sharper this time. "You'll want to stay off the road after dark." I stopped, turning back to him. "Excuse me." He didn't repeat himself. Instead, the door creaked open wider, and I caught a glimpse of the living room behind him. It was cluttered and dimly lit, with old mismatched furniture and what looked like animal traps hanging on the walls. But what made my stomach drop was a figure standing in the corner. A tall, lanky silhouette that didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Jenna must have seen it too, because she grabbed my hand, practically dragging me back to the car. We didn't speak until we were inside with the doors locked. I glanced at the farmhouse as I started the engine, half expecting the man or the woman, or whoever was in that corner, to come after us. But the porch was empty now, the screen door swaying slightly in the breeze. As we pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sure enough, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the woman standing at the edge of the field, the baby still on her hip. She was staring right at us, her face unreadable, and I swear, the baby's head turned to follow the car. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound coming from the tires crunching on the gravel road. Jenna kept glancing over her shoulder, her lips pressed into a tight line. I tried to focus on the map the man had given us, but it was practically useless. Just a few arrows and a vague outline of the area. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, tossing it onto the dashboard. Jenna didn't reply. She was staring out the window, her eyes wide, and I realized she hadn't stopped trembling since we left the farmhouse. "I don't think that was a baby," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words sent a jolt through me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though my heart was pounding. She shook her head, gripping the edge of her seat. "I don't know. It just didn't move. It didn't even blink." Her words brought back the image of the baby's waxy face, the strange stillness that had seemed so wrong at the time. But I didn't want to think about it, not while we were still so far from anywhere safe. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched across the road, turning the fields into a sea of black. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was only 6:30, but it felt like the night was rushing in faster than it should. We passed an old windmill, its blades creaking in the breeze, and then a rusted pickup truck abandoned in a ditch. The farther we drove, the more the landscape seemed to close in around us. The road narrowed, the cornfields growing taller and denser, their edges almost brushing against the car. I kept waiting for the GPS to come back online, but the screen stayed blank, the spinning icon taunting us. The deeper we drove, the more the air seemed to change. It was heavier, damp somehow, like we were driving into a storm even though the sky was perfectly clear. Jenna kept fidgeting in her seat, twisting her fingers in her lap. I wanted to tell her everything was fine, that we'd find the main road soon, but I didn't believe it myself. The road felt endless, winding in a way that didn't make sense. Every turn seemed to lead us deeper into the same landscape. Cornfields stretching out like an ocean, their stalks swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. Then we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road up ahead. My stomach dropped as I slowed the car, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty white shirt and suspenders. His head was tilted slightly to the side, and he wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows of the corn. "What is he doing?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, so still, made my skin crawl. I pressed on the gas, deciding to pass him as quickly as possible. As we approached, I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look directly at him. But Jenna couldn't help herself. "He's watching us," she said, her voice cracking. I glanced in the rearview mirror as we sped past, and my heart stopped. He had turned to face the car, his head cocked at the same unnatural angle. I could barely make out his face in the fading light, but there was something wrong with it, like his features didn't quite fit together. And then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he stepped into the corn and vanished. Neither of us said a word after that. My hands were clammy on the wheel, and Jenna was clutching her seatbelt like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The road ahead looked the same as it had for miles, but now it felt different, like it wasn't just empty but deliberately abandoned, as if we weren't supposed to be there. I kept stealing glances at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man standing in the middle of the road, staring after us. But it was always empty, the cornfield swallowing the horizon. Then, the headlights caught something up ahead, and my stomach flipped. It was a building, small and squat, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. A gas station. Relief washed over me for a split second before I realized something was off. The pumps were ancient, the kind with spinning dials instead of digital displays, and the sign above the door had been ripped down, leaving jagged edges of metal. But what chilled me most was the car parked out front. It was a rusted old sedan, the kind that hadn't been on the road for decades, and it was the only car there. I slowed to a crawl as we approached. Jenna leaned forward, squinting at the station. "Do you think anyone's inside?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. The place looked abandoned, but there was a faint light flickering inside, like a dying bulb. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the lot and parked a few feet from the pumps. "Stay here," I told Jenna, though she immediately shook her head. "No way. I'm not sitting in this car alone." I didn't argue. We both stepped out, the gravel crunching under our feet unnervingly loud in the quiet. The air outside felt colder than it had any right to be for a summer evening. Jenna stayed close to me as we approached the station, her arm brushing against mine. The glass door was smeared with dirt, and a handwritten sign that read "Open" hung crookedly inside. I pushed the door open, and a bell overhead gave a weak, tinny ring. The interior was dim, lit by a single fluorescent light that buzzed faintly. Rows of dusty shelves lined the small space, stocked with canned goods that looked decades old. An old cash register sat on the counter, its keys yellowed and cracked. But no one was there. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. There was no response. Just as I was about to turn back to Jenna, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from somewhere in the back. Jenna grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's just go," she whispered, her voice trembling. But something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was the stubborn hope that whoever was back there could help us, or maybe it was morbid curiosity. Against Jenna's protests, I stepped toward the counter and leaned over to peer into the doorway behind it. A figure emerged slowly from the shadows, and I immediately wished I hadn't looked. It was a man, or at least it had been. His skin was grayish and slack, like it was too big for his bones, and his eyes were sunk so deep into their sockets they were almost invisible. He shuffled forward, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a marionette on frayed strings. "You lost?" he croaked, his voice raspy and wet, as if speaking was a painful effort. I froze, unable to answer. Jenna tugged at me harder now, whispering urgently, "We need to leave. Now." The man, or whatever he was, stared at us, his head tilting to one side in that same unnatural way as the figure on the road. His lips stretched into a grin, but it wasn't comforting. It was too wide, revealing yellowed teeth that didn't seem to fit in his mouth. "You'll want to stay off the road," he said, his voice barely more than a wheeze. "Things get strange after dark." Jenna didn't wait for me to respond. She yanked my arm, pulling me toward the door, and this time I didn't argue. The bell above the door jingled as we stepped outside, and I felt a rush of relief just being back in the open air. But as we walked toward the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The rusted sedan that had been parked in front of the station was gone. I froze, my eyes scanning the empty lot. "It was right there," I muttered, more to myself than to Jenna. She didn't even look, she just kept walking, practically dragging me to the car. "I don't care," she snapped. "We're leaving." I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the doors. We climbed in, and I started the engine, the headlights slicing through the encroaching darkness. I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the lot as quickly as I could. But just as I shifted into drive, Jenna let out a strangled gasp. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing toward the side mirror. I glanced into it, and my stomach dropped. Standing at the edge of the gas station, partially obscured by shadow, was the same figure we'd seen in the cornfield. I slammed on the gas, the tires skidding on the gravel as we sped away from the gas station. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Jenna kept twisting around in her seat, her eyes darting between the side mirrors and the back window. "Is he following us?" she asked, her voice breaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't look. My focus was glued to the road ahead, which seemed darker and narrower than before, the tall corn on either side swaying ominously in the breeze. Then, the car started to sputter. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way the engine seemed to cough and struggle. But within seconds, the car began to slow, no matter how hard I pressed the gas pedal. "No, no, no," I muttered, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Jenna's breathing quickened as she gripped the door handle. "What's happening?" she demanded. I didn't have an answer. The engine gave one last pitiful groan before dying completely, leaving us coasting to a stop in the middle of the road. The silence that followed was deafening. I tried the ignition again, turning the key so hard it hurt my fingers. Nothing. Not even a click. Jenna was crying now, her hands covering her face. "This isn't real," she kept saying, over and over, like a mantra. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was still blank. Dead. Useless. That's when we heard it, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The crunch of gravel underfoot, coming from somewhere behind the car. The sound of footsteps grew louder, deliberate, unhurried. Jenna grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, too terrified to speak. My hand hovered over the ignition, instinctively trying to start the car again even though I knew it was useless. The footsteps stopped just behind us, and for a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence. Then, there was a tap, soft, almost playful, on the trunk of the car. Jenna let out a muffled scream, and I felt my body tense like a coiled spring. I wasn't thinking anymore. I just acted. "Stay here," I said, my voice barely audible, though I had no idea what I planned to do. Jenna grabbed my wrist, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't you dare," she hissed, but I gently pried her fingers away and stepped out of the car. The air outside was colder than before, and the sound of the gravel under my boots was painfully loud. I turned toward the back of the car, every nerve in my body screaming for me to get back inside. There was nothing there, just the empty road stretching into the darkness and the rustling of the cornfields in the wind. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me, though it felt premature. I turned back toward the car, ready to get us out of there on foot if I had to. That's when I saw it, or rather him. Standing just a few feet away, illuminated by the car's interior lights spilling through the open door, was the same figure we'd seen at the gas station and on the road. His face was slack, his eyes hollow, and his head tilted at that unsettling angle. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stared. For a moment, I was frozen, my mind scrambling for some way to rationalize what I was seeing. But there was no explanation, no way to make sense of the unnatural stillness of the figure or the oppressive weight of his gaze. My breath hitched, and I took a slow step backward, bumping into the car door. "Get in," Jenna hissed from inside, her voice trembling but urgent. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. The figure didn't move. He stood there in the glow of the car's interior light, his face tilted just enough for me to catch a hint of that awful grin. Jenna was sobbing now, her hands over her mouth as she tried to keep quiet. I fumbled for the keys, praying for a miracle, and twisted them in the ignition. To my shock, the engine sputtered to life. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the road ahead, and that's when we saw them. Dozens of figures were standing in the cornfields on either side of the road. They were half hidden by the stalks, their pale faces barely visible, all of them staring in our direction. I couldn't tell if they were people or something else, but they didn't move. They just watched, as if waiting for something. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the gear shift, but I forced myself to focus. "Hold on," I muttered to Jenna, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure her or myself. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, the tires squealing as we sped down the narrow road. As the car tore down the road, the figures in the fields didn't chase us. They just stood there, their faces fading into the darkness as we sped past. Jenna was curled into a ball in the passenger seat, her eyes squeezed shut, whispering something under her breath. I think it was a prayer. I kept my hands locked on the wheel, my knuckles white, my foot pressing the gas pedal as hard as it would go. The road felt endless, a tunnel of shadow with no sign of escape. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow faces or that terrible grin, but there was nothing behind us. Just the empty road. After what felt like an eternity, the cornfields gave way to open land, and then to scattered houses. The sight of a distant streetlight was like a lifeline, pulling us back to reality. The GPS blinked back to life, the cheerful voice announcing a route correction like nothing had happened. I pulled onto Route 50, my hands still trembling, and drove until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of a town. We didn't even discuss it, we just stopped. Inside the room, Jenna collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. I locked the door, triple-checked it, and then sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring out the window at the parking lot. I didn't sleep. I don't think Jenna did either. The faces we'd seen in the cornfields, the figure at the gas station, they were burned into my mind, as vivid as if they were still standing right outside. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. Bright sunlight, the hum of traffic on the highway, people going about their day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd barely escaped something we weren't supposed to see. When we finally made it to Denver, we didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not because they wouldn't believe us, but because we didn't want to relive it. Even now, when I see a cornfield or hear gravel crunching underfoot, I feel a chill run through me, like the memory is reaching out, trying to pull me back.